Hey there guys, alright, today we are back with another video from Alternate History Hub. This time, what if Africa was never colonized? Now before we dive into the video, make sure you go check out the links down in my description box or in my pinned comment in the comment section, where I have links to my Twitch channel where I stream Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Fridays, and Saturdays from 6 p.m. US Central Standard Time to about 9 p.m. US Central Standard Time. And then there's also a link to my gaming channel here on YouTube where I'm just uploading old stream VODs too. Love to have you guys come give me a follow over at Twitch and join the chat. Now, go ahead and hear Cody's theory as to what would have happened if Africa was never colonized. This is a really, because modern Africa wouldn't exist. And it's really hard to say what kind of... Now, I would say Northern Africa would probably largely still exist, like the same as it is today. Or, you know, you've got, at the very least, Egypt would pretty much be the same. You got Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and then Morocco. Morocco and Egypt, I want to say, are perhaps the easiest to say. They would probably relatively stay the same. But south of the Sahara, especially along the Gold Coast area here, honestly, I don't know how things would change here. South Africa also would be completely different, right? Because that's a huge influx of white colonists, or just South Africa, the Cape. Let's go ahead and hear his theory.
Has had a complex and turbulent history for the past couple of centuries, from the invasions by the Arabs to the eventual colonization of 90% of the land by Europeans. Africa has been left in a sorry state. With the news of the wars, genocides, and political turmoil inside the new nations of the continent, many point blame to the European powers who carved up Africa into their own colonies. This makes me wonder, what if the scramble for Africa never happened? What was this? The scramble for Africa was the rapid colonization and split of African land by the European powers. What if this rush of colonization never happened? What would the continent be like? Well, before we can talk about this, we need to learn some brief history.
Context!
What caused the scramble for Africa? For much of the 19th century, European powers were rapidly expanding across the globe. However, before 1870, Africa had remained mostly uncolonized by Europe, except for the French in Algeria, scattered Portuguese trading cities, and the British and Dutch in the south.
Yep.
This changed with King Leopold, I disgrace the name of Waffles, II, who annexed the Congo as his own personal property. Not even Belgian property, his personal land.
Fuck this king. This guy was a dickhead.
By doing so, Leopold freaked out the rest of Europe's empires, who began grabbing land to gain resources and outcompete rivals. To avoid conflict over the land, Germany invited the global powers to Berlin to discuss the future of Africa.
Yes, that was, fuck. Bismarck, there we go, that's the name. Why was I blanking on his name? Holy shit, that is embarrassing. Yeah, Bismarck, this is probably, aside from the unification of Germany, this is probably the, honestly, I would probably argue that this is the thing Bismarck is perhaps most well known for. The scramble for Africa.
The empires agreed on how to split the land, taking 90% of it. Very much oversimplified, after decades of European colonialism and 2 world wars, nationalist movements rose up and Africans slowly gained independence. However, the borders they were left with were clunky and odd, since they were drawn without concern for native demographics.
Yeah.
People who were alike were
Kind of what the Europeans like to do, isn't it?
split up, and people who were too different were lumped in the same nation, like if Britain and France were combined as the same country. Fighting started, governments fell. Much of Africa didn't have the education, infrastructure, or national identity fit for European-style nations, and fell into chaos. So what if the scramble for Africa never occurred? No matter how unlikely that would be, Europe certainly would have conquered Africa no matter what. But for some reason, let's say they never carve up the continent like they did in...
Yeah, really with the invention of trains, honestly, that's why the interior of Africa began to get colonized, right? You had the European nations pretty much all along the coastline, but not into the interior. But once the train was invented, that allowed them really to, colonize it. And you can actually look at I remember seeing this map. I can't remember where I saw it from though. But I remember seeing a map of the differences in the infrastructure, railroad infrastructure of like Africa compared to the United States and Europe. The infrastructure of America and Europe is interconnected. It's city to city, right? You can go across the country, go pretty much to any city in the United States on a train. Same with like Europe. You can't do that in Africa. Pretty much the infrastructure of Africa was set up for resources. The railroads just lead to where, they would, get their resources from, and then come back to the capital or wherever, port. And so that just shows the differences in kind of how Europeans viewed the colonization of Africa. It wasn't a place to live, right? America was a place settlers would go to live. And westward expansion, again, a place where settlers could go to live. Africa, a place where you would go to get resources. Nothing else. Not a place, at the very least, in the mindset of the European colonizers of the time.
Our timeline. That's what I'm going to explore. In this alternate timeline, Europeans still hold territory in Africa, but not much, only 10%,
All right, just
mostly
sticking to
around
the coast.
Europeans in this alternate timeline simply just don't invade the center of Africa and divide it amongst themselves. They continue the mutual trade with African kingdoms and tribes that occurred in our timeline, trading with Africans who brought resources from the center of the continent like ivory, gold, and other goods to the coastal trading ports which Europe held. Now, it's very unlikely this situation would last as Europe's imperial ambitions grew and technology improved. Direct rule became preferable over trading relations. However, for the sake of the scenario, let's say the balance stays. Now, a real question that needs to be asked is, what would life be like in sub-Saharan Africa in this alternate timeline? Would it be a utopian paradise free from the violence stirred by Europe? Or would it be a backwards, uncivilized place never improving? The answer is not so black and white, pun intended. If you went into this video asking, would Africa be like Europe and Asia, the answer is no. Even with enough trade and exchange of ideas, most sub-Saharan African people were not technologically advanced enough to compete with Europe and East Asia. In this alternate timeline, if Europeans invested more in trade with native Africans instead of conquering them, they could indirectly cause the spread of new African empires. Why? Because it already happened in our timeline with another tribal people. In colonial North America, the native tribes and European colonists had a beneficial relationship based on the trade of furs. The natives would trap animals and sell the furs to the colonial powers. The Europeans would give numerous goods, such as weapons, in return. Some tribes began to run out of fur to trade. The only way to get more fur was more land. This spawned a brutal and horrific war. The British and Dutch allies.
This is an amazing point because it again shows that no matter what, let's say the roles were reversed and Africa had the resources necessary to become kingdoms, society like European or Asia, right, where they could have these vast spanning imperial powers, right, strong governmental bodies, like monarchies see in Europe, or the Chinese emperor or the Japanese emperor, right? It shows with the example of the Iroquois that humans, no matter where, will always conquer other people, right? Partially because of the Eurocentrism that has happened throughout pretty much modern history, and now it's being course corrected where pushing back against that Eurocentrism. One of the faults of Eurocentrism is this that kind of concept kind of blends into people that perhaps are not, do not go further into history, right? They don't learn more. They don't want to learn. They don't see these kind of trends, like, so they kind of assume like, oh, Europeans and Japanese and the Chinese were the only like people to do this, right? But in reality, it's just because they were the ones that had the means, the capability to do it. Anyone else, if they had the capability to do it, would do it. I mean, we see it with the Aztec Empire. They were the dominant power they became the dominant power of their region, and they took advantage of their power spread. Little
allied and armed the Iroquois Confederacy against the French and their allied tribes. The Iroquois rapidly expanded, seizing territory from neighboring tribes, and even depopulating entire regions of local tribes. In this alternate timeline, the same thing would apply. If Europeans were going to trade with sub-Saharan Africans instead of conquering them, native kingdoms would need to expand to keep up with demand. Europeans give weapons to their preferred kings and tribes, like how they did in the Americas.
Yep. I mean, that's what they did when the slave trade was really starting, or even when they were first landing in Africa, is they started working alongside West African local leaders, right? And then those local leaders, like, we know this happened, those local leaders would go and then fight another tribe and capture the people of that tribe and then sell them into slavery to the Europeans.
British and Germans indirectly influencing leaders through trade and supplying them weapons. This has positives and negatives. The positives is that large civilizations would have spread rapidly across Africa throughout human.
Yeah, so the one positive that there is that's popping out to me from this idea of this what if is that these would still be European influenced, but they won't be African nations born from Europe, right? It's definitely Europeans are trading and influencing the local leaders, and of course they're probably going to work with African leaders that perhaps most resemble a European society, right? Because that's kind of how biases work in humans. You want to work alongside someone that represents closer to probably your culture, most looks like you too, is something that happens with a lot of humans. Like you want it happens with entertainment, right? You want to see a reflection of yourself in a movie, right? You want to see a reflection of yourself in comics, TV, whatever. And when you're doing deals on a nationwide scale, you also want to do that with people that kind of have similar cultural, beliefs as you. So going back, yeah, it would make sense for certain, probably closer to European style African leaders to perhaps start gaining power, because they would be the ones perhaps Europeans would trade the most with. However, this also means though that these would be nations forged by Africans. These wouldn't be nations carved out by Europeans, which is a positive.
Human history, civilizations have been formed through war and conquest. The same thing would happen in Africa, just at a faster rate. New kingdoms would try to claim land in the center. The land and culture would be divided and influenced by Africans, instead of being conquered like in our timeline by Europeans. The negatives is the mass violence itself. Europe would give modern weapons to native kings. We saw this terrible violence happen with Africans capturing Africans for the slave trade, and in the Americas with the natives. It would happen at a much larger scale in Africa with modern equipment supplied. Now, about Africa on the global scale. Even if kingdoms did conquer throughout the continent, sub-Saharan Africa would certainly remain very tribal, with very little political entities in the center of the continent, an oddity in a world made up of nation-states. In this alternate timeline, Ethiopia would remain a prominent empire, while various Somali city-states would trade with the Arabs and Europeans. In South Africa, the British and Dutch already control much of the region, and so I imagine an apartheid-like system would still occur. The history of the entire globe would be changed since the scramble for Africa formed new imperialism in Europe, diverting resources for colonies in Asia to Africa. This imperialism was one of the driving factors for World War I, so without the scramble for Africa, it affects the history of the entire 20th century. In this alternate...
However, I wouldn't say that it gets rid of the high probability of World War I. The Balkans and the alliance system really kicked it off.
Timeline, Africa's relationship to the world would be complex and odd. Spurred by Europe's trade, kingdoms would be across the coast waging war against one another. In Central Africa, there would hardly be any political entity. Order would be maintained by the various villages who would remain undeveloped. In this alternate timeline, sub-Saharan Africa would have works of art and culture, but technologically and economically would always be behind, subject to outside powers, be it European or Arabs. However, even if the continent would be influenced, the African states would be developed by Africans, not drawn by Europe.
As I said earlier,
the past century of horrendous violence, genocide, state-sponsored atrocities, and famines would not occur, but this...
famines probably would still occur because... no, that's what happens.
Doesn't mean things would be happy sunshine. Humans are naturally brutal, and tribal life is still extremely hard. Violence, ethnic and religious hatred would still occur. Much of the continent would be undeveloped. Life expectancy still is lower compared to the rest of the world. Diseases kill many, and infant mortality is still high. Relief efforts from more prosperous nations still occur in this alternate timeline. Whether Africa would have been better in this alternate timeline is up to your own opinion. Much of the violence would be downplayed, however the issues of low education, underdevelopment, and disease would still occur. This is just one scenario. We'll never 100% know how something would be, but it's nice to theorize. Like on Facebook and help support...
Alright, that was What If Africa Was Never Colonized by Alternate History Hub. I think this was a good take on it. It's honestly, you know, this is probably one of the most improbable ideas, what ifs he's done, because of just, you know, the invention of the railroad and trains pretty much guaranteed the expansion of European powers into the interior of Africa, in my opinion. I think because of how, you know, how technologically and economically lagged behind much of Africa was, right? North Africa doesn't have this problem, hence why it was a little bit harder to colonize. However, it still got colonized. Like Morocco would give I believe the French some problems. You know, there's Egypt kinda was also, you know, it's pretty much Libya and Tunisia and Algeria that really got colonized in the north. But yeah, I personally think that the colonization of Africa, once the Europeans were colonizing the coastline, I think once that's set in stone, they're eventually going to expand further into the interior the moment they can. Right? That's how I see it. So, yeah, but still fun to theorize. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.